Okay. So often the first talk at a retreat, I will discuss some of the possible experiences that occur during retreat, how to navigate that. And 90% of that is just knowing it's okay, it's normal, it happens. I mentioned this briefly in the opening talk today, but I'll unpack it a little bit more. And then I'll talk about filtering. So when we enter a retreat situation, there are structural and practical aspects to what opens us, meaning we put away distractions, or the retreat setting itself, the structure, something that's already pre-decided. So we have the opportunity to really just give ourselves to the flow of the retreat. A little different online, of course, but effectively the same thing, where we can just rely on the bells, rely on the timers and the scheduled timing. And other than that, we're left with no specific responsibilities other than this practice or this surrender or this investigation in the immediate. So the structure and practicalities of the way a meditation retreat or an inquiry-based retreat is set forth already clears out a lot of what could be called unnecessary thinking and analysis, and even behaviors, movements, and so forth. We often notice this in day-to-day life, where we feel as if we're getting things done, we're addressing the practicalities of life, but something feels like it's spinning its wheels, or there's just an unnecessary layer of thought, or an unnecessary amount of struggle or indecision, or sometimes even disorientation. And interestingly, when we're not in retreat, often we actually look for stability, or we utilize stability in the dream or the illusion itself, the illusion of separation. So we can find a certain kind of stability in mind identification and social endorsement of the mind identified world, which doesn't exist. It's not an actual world. It's just a way of speaking about this. So we find a sort of stability in that, but underlying it is this feeling of discontent or discord or unsatisfactoriness. And that's why we take up this investigation in the first place. But that requires a lot of management, more than we realize. It requires a lot of complicity. It requires a lot of activity to maintain that illusion. So in practical terms, when we commit to a retreat, we really commit to not using that illusory world, that socially endorsed illusory world of separation, self and other, pushing and pulling, problems and solutions, to not using that to navigate this. We've made the commitment to, again, allow the practicalities to just be set aside for everything but the retreat itself, the timing, when to listen, when to meditate, when to eat, when to go to sleep, when to wake up. We can really just give ourselves to that, practically speaking, which is very nice. And that does more than most people would realize, I think. Once you've done this a few times or many times, you start to really understand the benefit of doing that. But at first it might not be obvious. But it has a huge effect, actually, to just, in practical terms, take yourself out of that social matrix and plop yourself here. Now, we are with a group of people, but because we've all committed to this, we're not perpetuating the illusion ourselves, and we're not requiring anyone else to perpetuate that illusion. Instead, in whatever way we each do it, we're investigating our true nature, or the true nature of this right here, right now, presence. So that's the practical aspect of this sort of concentrated or sustained meditation or inquiry event, this retreat that we take part in. Now, again, that is powerful. It has a lot of value and a lot of it's unseen, but it also has effects, and those effects start to give the ego, or the usual sense of me as I fit into everything, and how I know myself in reference to what I think other people think about me and my roles in life, all of that. When it's given nothing to do, sometimes it feels good, feels relaxing and peaceful. Other times it feels very disorienting, right? It's like we don't know where to orient or how to orient when the usual ways that we use to stabilize ourselves in the world of mind identification just aren't there, or we've committed to setting them aside. Sure, we could get distracted here if we wanted to. We could mess around on the internet and do all the things. We could, and probably will to some degree, right? No one's perfect in retreat, but even a 70% reduction in how much of that we do is going to actually have a significant effect. So that's the practical aspects. And this is why in my intros and invites to retreats and these initial talks, I really encourage people to commit to the degree you can, time-wise. Follow the schedule to the degree you can. That in and of itself, just doing that, just giving yourself to the retreat, is hugely beneficial. It's something that many people go through their entire life never really doing. And I don't mean to a specific type of retreat or a spiritual retreat or a Zen retreat, but just disengaging in a practical sense from the usual distractions, largely. So it's a huge opportunity, and the mere commitment to do that is of huge value. And you may or may not see the effects immediately, but it doesn't really matter. The second aspect that comes into play is really more of a heart level commitment, a commitment to, in a deep place inside of us, reflect on if we're authentic and honest with ourselves, the ways in which our tendency, our habit force of using that illusory world to try to stabilize ourselves, to admit to ourselves that that doesn't work, or doesn't work well. Or maybe I could just say it has a pretty significant side effect, and that is what we call suffering, or in Buddhism might be called unsatisfactoriness. And when we notice that, we acknowledge that, and then we put ourselves in this setting, in this situation, that mere recognition that the ways we take ourselves to be, the ways we perceive ourselves, the illusory identities don't work. And in some settings can cause various degrees of violence, maybe just unkindness, maybe just self-centeredness, maybe worse, right? And when we acknowledge that, that's sort of one entry point to that heart space. Another entry point to that heart space is to take that and say, okay, because of that, I'm committed to finding a way through the illusion of identity, the illusion of separation, the illusion of separate will that feels like pushing or pulling at life. That's the heart level commitment. to dig in, because we can see that the other way doesn't really work. And for me, and I see it in people who I think wake up reasonably quickly, or at least at a steep steep path, which, by the way, is not better necessarily. It can be really very difficult. But what that means in simple terms is all of the other ways really don't work. They're not deeply satisfying. And sometimes they're very unsatisfying, like literally everything. All of the ways we've learned to make our relationships better, all the ways we've learned to self-care, all the ways we've learned to heal, all that stuff has its value. There's nothing wrong with any of it, but it's just not deeply satisfying. It doesn't really deliver the goods because there's something there co-opting it, and we know it. And that's our illusory separate self. That fueling this intention to let go into the experience of presence right now, into the experience of retreat, and allow retreat to take us wherever it's going to take us. Was a very, very powerful intention or commitment. You can feel into that. The beauty of this is this goes beyond techniques. If you get what I mean here with this heart level commitment, it usurps any technique. Now, good techniques applied at the right time, the right question, the right inquiry, sustained meditation, and a sort of cultivated samadhi, they're all very valuable in this process. They're helpful. They're synergistic. But all of those can be there. And if this heart-based commitment isn't there yet, that's when things sometimes feel stuck spiritually or with the process, or feel like ambivalence. Ambivalence is like, yeah, I really do want to investigate. I do want to wake up. I do want to dissolve the illusory boundaries. And at the same time, I want whatever I want, right? The end of that Tool song goes, I want what I want. I want what I want. I want what I want. It's the voice of addiction. We have all kinds of addictions. Yeah. As Paul Hederman says, the worst addiction, or the most insidious, is the addiction to self, the illusory self. So that acknowledgement that it just doesn't work is really, to me, it's kind of where surrender occurs or begins. So when we do that, when we take on those two aspects of committing to retreat, the practical and the sort of heart-based, we very quickly throw off a lot of filters, throw off a lot of the usual ways we filter ourselves from feeling doubt, fear, anger, shame, confusion, disorientation. The usual filters that filter those out so quickly we don't even know they're there, which is thought, which is identified thought. A lot of that just kind of drops pretty quickly. And it can feel very relaxing for a few rounds of meditation or even a half a day. It may feel relaxing through the entire retreat. But sometimes after that first initial relaxation phase, some heavier material starts coming in. One way of saying it is we open up this expansion of consciousness, of awareness, perhaps. And with that, there's just a natural knowing or a natural instinct that it's safe or prudent, perhaps, to allow deeper fixated energies to come up into consciousness. They have to. That's the way that feels. So when there's any identification with consciousness, it can be quite uncomfortable, right? Because it's like, who am I all of a sudden? Or why am I feeling this so directly? And it's so intense. I would have never expected it. Where did it come from? What's it about? None of that works, right? Knowing what it's about, where it came from. That's just more trying to run into the mind to try to, distance ourselves a bit. But again, in a retreat setting, when we've put aside the filters, this stuff just comes. And it can be, again, intense, disorienting, and so forth. So as I mentioned in the earlier talk, there's a lot of value in just, number one, acknowledging that this is okay. It's par for the course. Maybe you came into retreat with an expectation or a hope for a mystical experience, and instead you got shame suddenly in very intense ways. That's okay. It's part of how this goes. It's not on your timing. The way retreats flow and the way the experiences rise and subside aren't on anyone's timing or preference. They just are. So knowing, first of all, it's not abnormal, it's not uncommon, and it's often par for the course. That's quite helpful, just that acknowledgement. And then second, just give it some time. Be patient. Sometimes these intense experiences, intense emotions, contraction, even disorientation, they stick around for a while. But if we just return to the present, to, we could say, our practice, to a question, who, to a sensation, to all of the sensations, to sound, then it's all rectified immediately. It's right back on course. There's no specific course, of course, but that's all you need to do. And if there's still intensity in the background, if the body's still feeling contraction, fear, disorientation, that's okay. It's okay to notice it. And then return to just this sensation, just the soundscape, just the movement of consciousness, or the immediate experience of being, which is undeniable. It's not something you can step outside of. It's all encompassing. And that's the answer. And without trying to count the minutes or hours until some uncomfortable experience goes, you just stay the course with this, stay here. You'll notice it drops. The emotion will change. The mental formation will dissolve and reform into something else. Or if it's all at an energetic level, which often it is after deep realization, the energetics and the conditions will naturally morph and change. And you'll be in a different world, in another world, and another world. Whole entire worlds come and go. But this attunement to presence, to the textures of experience, even the non-dualistic textures of experience that have no particular place in time or space, and yet are undeniably intimate. That's your attunement. That's it. Nothing more to do. The apparent sound flows into the apparent sensation, flows into the apparent consciousness. Then all those labels stop making any sense. And there's just this, thusness. There's nothing more to do here. Don't count the hours. Don't worry about hours. Hours are thoughts. Don't worry about progress. Progress is a thought. Don't use any of those orientations. And the practice, or what's what, will naturally reveal itself here, again and again and again. So just let it take you. Now, as I mentioned, sometimes an emotion that's so unexpected, or a contraction, is extremely intense. And not only is it intense, the mind's really getting a hold of you. And here are the signs of that. I can't handle this. This is overwhelming. It's too much for me. What if it just keeps going for day after day, right? All that's thought. But those thoughts seemingly intensify the experience unnecessarily. If you notice their thoughts, you're able to return to the primary experience of sensation, perhaps contraction, and perhaps even the immediate experience that it just doesn't feel good. I wouldn't prefer it, but it doesn't necessarily have to go beyond that. And anything beyond that really is thought. So that can be helpful if it's really just feel like you're just being dragged through the mud for hours and hours or 2 days or something. Really look at your perceptions, your interpretations of the experience and what it means. Does it mean that something's wrong with me? Does it mean I've wasted my time in the retreat? Does it mean that I'm fundamentally flawed? Right? All of these are thoughts. Sometimes just seeing clearly, seeing a thought as a thought, a sensation as a sensation, it just rectifies everything. And then, as I mentioned earlier today as well, if it's really intense and you just feel sort of destabilized or whatever, just take some time off. You don't have to meditate every round. Take a walk outside, take a walk in nature, touch the ground if it's not 15 degrees below. Do natural meditation, no guided intention, no particular intention. Take a nap, take a bath, and do anything sensory, physical sensory, tactile sensory. It's a very powerful practice, even and maybe especially in deep stage realization, to remain in that physical contact, even when there's no sense of boundaries, even when there's no sense of a world or a self. That radiant texture of sensation is a perfect tuning fork. It guides you right back in to this, where there's no problem that could arise. It's just what is. So I touched on the remainder of the talk. I'm going to talk about filtering of mind. And I touched on this at the beginning of this talk, but I'll go into more detail of what I mean by that. To put it very simply, a very simple formula for what we're doing here. What is this about? Why are we crazy enough to take a week off from everything to feel emotions and feel uncomfortable and keep inquiring? What is enlightenment? What is liberation? What is the meaning of all of this? What is the solution to the problem of birth and death? All of that, those are just different ways of saying this human condition of suffering. Why do we engage this? So just a simple model for that, or a simple way of saying it, is what causes suffering is perceiving through filters. And the filters are essentially of the mind or of thought. When we perceive reality through filters of various types, and there are various types, the effect is a feeling of discontent. Sometimes it's a mild discontent, sometimes it's an overwhelming discontent. But that feeling itself, the feeling of discontent, is grace. Because without that, I think a lot less people would wake up. Some probably would, but it's a blessing in disguise. It's our tuning fork. And what will go a long way is to just recognize the nature of filtering or binding that occurs as a result of the way we interact with thought. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with thought or with a thought or with consciousness, but there's a sort of relational quality that arises, and then layers are added to it, and it becomes something profoundly uncomfortable for many people. So that's why we take up these endeavors, practices, retreats, and so forth. So in no particular order, I'll just list some filters. And if you notice these as you meditate, as you sit, as you go about your day, during retreat or even after retreat, if you notice these filtering tendencies, the advice really is, first of all, just to see it clearly. I think 90% of this is about that, seeing it clearly enough and enough times. Sometimes you do have to see the same filter or fixation again and again before it sort of stops or dissolves itself. That's most of it. It's just seeing it. It's just actually seeing what's really happening. Oh, a thought is catching me. A thought that says I'm disoriented and I don't know why, and I need to figure out why. And until I figure out why, I won't feel okay. To be able to see that, oh, that's a thought. Okay, can I find who that thought refers to or what that thought refers to? Okay, well, I can't find that. So then what is the thought? What is the nature of the thought? If it doesn't refer to anything outside of itself, maybe I should just investigate the nature of thought itself, or the substance of where thought appears to arise, the substance of where I, as the thinker, appear to arise. Direct investigation of consciousness itself. That goes a long way. The next thing I'll add to that is, so it's optional. You can, once you recognize a certain kind of filtering process going on, you can remind yourself that that is literally one thought right now. If the filtering mechanism is, I'm exhausted, for instance. The filter is seeing the world and what you perceive as yourself in the world through a filter that says, I'm defined by my exhaustion. I'm defined by my tiredness. Suddenly, view is contracted down very narrowly, because that's not all you are. You might be tired, you might be exhausted, but there's a lot more going on. And when it goes beyond identity, there's a hell of a lot more going on. So the filter is a narrowing of attention, right? So in a case like that, this sort of second step I'm describing, it could be just reminding yourself this is one thought that says I'm exhausted, and because of that, XYZ. Can I hold that one thought here right now and not react to it? Not go down the thought stream, contemplating its implications? If I hold it, what happens? Does it slip through my fingers like sand? Can I even find it? It's like, instead of having an oppositional relationship with thought, we have a sort of curious relationship with thought, with one thought. So that can, in and of itself, just stop the whole machinery of thinking, of thought stream to the next thought, to the next thought, to the next thought. That's one potential way to approach it. And then a third thing is a little more, perhaps, work intensive, but with a filter that really sticks around a lot, keeps coming back, feels recurrent, or feels particularly heavy or sticky for you. The third thing is more precise inquiry. And once you've gotten to the point where you can see that the filter is a thought, the inquiry can be, what are the associated thoughts, right? Kind of the example I used is I'm exhausted. But what's the feeling tone of that? What else does that mean to you? Well, when I'm exhausted, that means that I'm probably going to be in a bad mood today. Okay, so there's an associated thought that says, because, not that I am exhausted, but because I perceive myself as exhausted, now I also have set myself up to believe that I have to be in a bad mood today, or not productive, or whatever, right? So that third step is, again, more maybe work intensive, but it can be really valuable in really sticky beliefs or deeply rooted beliefs, or beliefs that feel kind of gray, like hard to see into, but you know something's there. Just ask yourself, well, what are the associated beliefs with this? What beliefs are required for me to believe this belief, right? What beliefs are sort of prerequisites, and what other beliefs are a result of this? Yeah. And then again, it's just about clear seeing. The more you kind of look into that and go, oh yeah, I see, I feel why that's uncomfortable, because I believe that if X, Y, Z condition in my life occurred today, then other things are going to happen later that are problematic, right? Is it true? Is that actually true? Or is it a narrative that's become habituated such that we have an avoidant tendency toward the whole narrative because it feels uncomfortable? And that's where the discomfort is, right? The discomfort isn't out there where the thought seems to be pointing to, called later today, because there is no later today. That's just the way the thought looks. The discomfort is actually in our relationship and belief, and then subsequently avoidance of thought. It's that standing wave of disassociation, or a stable disassociated thinking experience, mind identification. So again, seeing all aspects of the associated beliefs often just start to collapse that feeling of pushing and pulling on thoughts, which results often in we dramatically reduce pushing and pulling on the external world, or, actual life, however you want to say that. So that's kind of an approach you can take with filters, with mental filters. So what are the types of filters that occur? So these are in no particular order. So a belief about a situation or a person, like a structured belief that can feel real as if it's objectively true about something out there, or with some disidentification or just some mindfulness or inquiry, can feel like, oh, it's actually a belief about what's going on out there, right? Maybe partially true, maybe not true at all, maybe largely true, but I can't really know because right now I can recognize that's simply one thought, right? So again, the belief that I'm exhausted, that's one you could look at in that way and say, that's a belief about a situation and a person, me, and the situation is this day, this moment. You could also have a belief that says, the classic one is like, my boss is a jerk or something, right? Or my coworker is just not a nice person. A fleeting thought that says that is not a problem. But when it starts to define our experience and our attention's like really zoomed in on it, and we've been thinking about it all day, well, there's probably some fixation and some filtering going on. So a big part of it is to recognize it as a thought. Like, that person isn't a jerk, whatever that is, right? That's not what defines that human being. They may have certain tendencies or whatever, but what's really happening is I'm having a thought that says that person's a whatever. And that little bit of distancing from the thought is usually enough to realize, oh my gosh, I've been looking at this as if it was some kind of objective reality that I'm stuck in. And rather, no, I'm just struggling with a thought of my own that came out of wherever it came out of. Now, again, this isn't suggesting that in practical terms, sometimes you have to do something out there in the world with, if somebody's whatever causing problems for you at work, you may need to talk to them or whatever. But that's not what's happening right here. Right here, we're sitting in meditation. Right here, we're sitting at a retreat. We're at home. We're not at work, right? So when the mind is trying to make it look like we're at work, that's a really good time to say, oh, this is a thought, right? This is one single thought. So that's a filter that says the situation or the person is the way I think they are. Like that they're actually a certain way, in the way my mind can summarize it in a very simple package. That's a filter. And you could call it the filter of judgment. It happens all the time, right? That person's good, that person's bad, that person's nice to me, that one's not, that one's hard worker, that one's not a hard worker. All of it. It just goes on and on and on. So with the sort of 3-step approach I described earlier, you could apply that to a situation like that, where you recognize a filter in the form of a belief about a situation, a belief about a person. And that relieves a lot of tension when we realize, man, that's not happening. It's not really happening right now, right? Sounds are happening. Sensations in the body are happening. There's thoughts. But whatever that thought seems to be pointing to, that I a moment ago was identified with, that felt real, that felt important, that's just not happening. So that's kind of like a judgment filter. We have a lot of those about not only others, but ourselves. The ones about ourselves are harder to see often than when we judge others. Usually it's something about ourselves, but that can be not obvious right away. So a way to approach that and probably many people here know this and maybe do this. A way to approach that, though, is if you feel upset by someone, triggered by someone, something they did, something they said, or just how they are, ask yourself this question that can be kind of difficult at first, and that is, what is it about that person that reminds me of me? Right? And if you're really identified with that belief, like you're sure that person is that way, then it'll be really hard to do this, because you'll be like, no, I know they're that way. I don't do that. Right. But if you just keep asking and you allow yourself to really feel, oh, this is just one thought arising, then you have the opportunity to sort of go, okay, maybe I've never done what they just did. Like I've not done it that way. Right. That selfish thing they did. But there are ways I'm selfish, and I can see those. I can also see they're related to that person's behavior. Oh, okay. All right. So now there's the sort of filter of turning attention outward, sort of blame, right? Blame filter, let's call it. So we're engaging something that we perceive to be out there. It's not, but we're engaging that person, that situation, to purposely avoid our own feeling of inadequacy or shame or et cetera. Now, this is another really common one. And I think you can do it in that two-step approach by start seeing the judgment filters outwardly, then start to see that they're actually reflecting something inward, or you can do them separately. But I think it's a little easier once you've worked through some of that external judgment and filtering to see that actually it's looking through a filter when you see that the world is a certain way, a person is a certain way. Everything's dynamic, right? Then it's like, okay, well, why is that judgment even formed in that way in the first place? Like, for instance, I may have certain judgments about people in one area of life, and in another area of life, I don't have them. And another person, it may be the opposite. So why do I have particular proclivities to judge a certain situation, et cetera? That's that sort of filter of avoiding our own beliefs about ourselves. And blame is a great way to do it. We just project it outward, and then we can endlessly convince ourselves it's because of that person or that person or that person. And we can even get into arguments with them, right? It's just avoiding something. So that filter that says what I perceive externally is actually external, right? And these are still functioning sort of in the psychology spectrum, the personal psychology spectrum. That they're not getting down yet to the actual filters of self and other, but they're certainly reflections of them, right? There's like the psychological or the conventional ways we perceive ourselves in the world and others. All of that is sort of a reflection of that underlying misperception, which is quite subtle, but it's quite profound when it dissolves, that there is a self and others, right? There is a past and a future. So yeah, that this other type of filtering, the second type of filtering is perceiving that what we are projecting externally is somehow apart from or not connected directly to our own internal perceptions about ourselves. And in the same way, you can investigate those. There's also the filter of expectation. And this has to do with time, the belief in time. If you ever don't get the doctrine that there's no time, eternity, there's pretty easy ways to lead yourself back to it. And that is to just sit here, 5 senses, taste, smell, touch, hear, see, just kind of move your attention through those. That's what's here, or apparently here. And there's thought or consciousness or the sense of being. May or may not be there, may or may not be prominent. There's nothing else you're going to experience except for a projection of thought, right? So you can test that by imagining right now, like here you are in this whatever, or here this is. And then you can create a thought that says, okay, I don't know, later today I'm going to eat salad for lunch, right? You can imagine that, or you can use that narrative in your mind. Did you suddenly find yourself eating salad? Like, did you beam to the future? Okay. Can you do it with any future mental projection? Can you actually touch that place we're calling the future? No, and you can't, and you never have, right? Same with past. Remember anything. Remember 10 minutes ago. Remember an hour ago. Remember a day ago. Hold the memory in your mind, the images, the narrative of what was going on. Okay, great. Did that suddenly bring you physically to that environment, to that experience? Never did, never will, right? So you can remind yourself now what we're talking about is eternity, which means not in time. Eternity isn't a long time like immortality. It's just not in time. It's an experience of timelessness. And from this experience of timelessness, we can perceive, we can start to see the illusion of expectation. And this is an interesting one. I think this sticks around until quite deep stages of realization. And the expectation is often a mental image, or it could be a narrative. But it's like, here's what I think should happen in 5 minutes. Here's what I expect to happen in 10 minutes or 1 hour from now. Right? The problem with that should be obvious, and that is you can't know that. You can't know the future, right? You might have a good guess, and that's fine. But there's no actual direct experience. So it's a thought. It's always a thought. And what happens when we have an expectation and there's underlying discontent already, but we don't recognize it because we're using that expectation that kind of feels good because we kind of believe in it by imagining it. And we think that's going to make us suddenly feel better. And then, of course, we're very disappointed when it doesn't play out like that, and then we don't feel better. So we get frustrated or impatient, frustration and impatience, right? That's the filter of expectation. It seems like we need expectation to plan. It seems like we need that mental expectation, right? Grabbing onto those thoughts that naturally arise that say, oh, it's going to be like this or it's going to be like that. When we grab onto that, and we identify with that, we're setting ourselves up to feel disappointment, frustration, irritability, etc. That's the filter of expectation. You know, in practical terms, I know many minds will not like this because it's like, well, no, I have to plan. No, you plan right now. You've only ever planned right now. Planning can only happen now. It doesn't happen in the future, right? And adjustment to whatever happened or happens as reality changes and morphs as it always does also only happens right now. So what is it in there that gets wedged in saying, but it has to go in this imagined way? Doesn't. You'll still make adjustments. You'll still adapt, and you'll adapt better and more fluidly and make adjustments more intelligently when there's no attachment to the outcome. This is very commonly described in Hinduism. In the Bhagavad Gita, it's like this, work without attachment to the fruits of your labor and so forth. That's what, in my opinion, that's what this is about. It's referred to in the Bible as well. Christ talked about this. I can't think of the quotes right now, but let tomorrow take care of itself, essentially. And that can have a freeing experience when you first taste it and you first sort of apply it. But I think it takes quite a while to realize how deep those implications actually go, of being so trusting of presence, sensory presence, the luminous nature of non-dualistic sense experience, having so much trust in that you just stay in it. And what will happen will happen. It'll take care of itself. There'll be times when no planning's happening. There'll be times when planning's happening. But overall, strangely, in my experience and kind of watching other people go through it, overall, it actually sorts things out better than you ever could have. But it won't be in the way you expect it. And it will feel discordant sometimes as you make that adjustment. But that's the filter of expectation. That what's going to happen 1 minute from now is actually real somehow. Or really, you don't even have to look at it as real or unreal. More like, why does that expectation have to define my experience? Why am I attached to it? You don't need expectations. So that's the filter of expectation, perhaps the filter of time. And when that grows into a monster, it can be really uncomfortable. The sort of prison of time where you never feel like you have enough time and you're stressed and you're on the clock and trying to get as much done as you can. You can never get enough done. And right, that gets tied into shame and everything else, but that's really uncomfortable. And that's when we not just believe in time, but we sort of live in this prison of mental time throughout a lot of our day. And then there's the filter of space, or we could say the fundamental dualistic filter. And that is, I'm here and everything else is not here. Like I'm the subject to experience and everything else is, or are objects of experience. That means people, situations, objects, all of it, places, it's all out there somewhere. And I'm somewhere in here. And that separation, that dualistic experience is fundamentally true. This is a filter that is deeply rooted in the identity structure. It's not something that falls early, although you can have tastes of what it's like to not have that filter for a short time earlier on. Sometimes happens with psychedelics. Sometimes it just happens randomly. Can happen in meditative situations or listening to a powerful talk or something, but it's often short-lived. Some people will describe it as universal love or unity, and it's like the most enjoyable thing they've ever experienced and the most real thing they've ever experienced, which is good and bad. It's good because there's a truth to it. The bad part is that you tend to really chase that. It's and compare everything else you experience after to that. And then you'll be comparing it to a memory.
Angelo, you have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. You'll be comparing that to a memory, right? But sometimes it's actually scary. So the merging, or just you just feel like you just fall into this presence so fully that there's like not a you there. And it's not scary right at that moment. What's scary is when the mind tries to disassociate back from it. And it's like, whoa, what just happened to me? You know, like I could be gone, right? So that can be scary. A different kind of fear barrier can come with that. So strangely, it can have quite varied interpretations, that experience of oneness, but it's an experience. Much later on, when that perceptual filter stops operating of subject and object, of self and other, or selfness and otherness, or even awareness and everything else, is a very different experience. It's a intimacy that can't be undone. It's a just natural rising intimacy of experience. You are the environment in one sense. You're the experiential environment, but there's not a you in it so much. It's just the environment experiencing itself. And that's the filter of separation, of space, ultimately. That one feels much less personal than other filters. It's more something you become very curious about in the visual field, usually. When you start looking for evidence that there's any separation or dividing line between what feels like a subject and what feels like an object, or it feels like you and what feels like that which you are aware of right now, to see if that fundamental dualistic experience is grounded anywhere at all. Does it have any truth to it? Does it have any evidence for it? So it's a very subtle and direct investigation of that experience. And then finally, there's the filter of self, which is probably, I would say, it's really the most fundamental filter. It is the most fundamental filter. Doesn't mean that there's no other quote unquote work to be done after that. There is, but it's not done by you. It's a natural process, but that is a very, very fundamental filter that doesn't fall early on. It's really late stage, and it can easily be overlooked, even with non-dual realization, clear, non-dual, formless, intimate, ongoing, undeniable realization. There can still be a sense of someone there somewhere that wants it to be for them, or feels like it refers back to them, refers back to me, even if that's a consciousness, even if that's some kind of ground of being that we're taking ourselves to be. That's still an illusion. It's still a filter, but it's a very, very subtle filter. It's not one you can just dismantle by understanding no self, or understanding dogma, understanding Buddhism. That's not going to work. One way of approaching that, if it's still there, would be noticing the vastness and intimacy of sound, the non-locatability, undeniability, empty, radiant nature of sound, and do the same with sensations. Do the same with the visual field. Then try to turn that type of inquiry on any remaining sense of I am. You can even state I am and see what that even does. Where does that go? Does it show you anything? Is there a place for that? Is there a location for that? Where that occurs, where it arises? Is it a different experiential, does it have a different experiential texture than sound or sensation? So it's a really subtle looking and very direct looking, and it's none of this is conceptual at all. It's very much in the immediate. So when that filter falls, there's no more filtering of the mind. And that seems like, based on everything that happened before, it would be really great, or the end of something. And it is the end of something for sure. But it doesn't mean everything's done. In fact, what it means is the energetics and any subtle habituated resistance patterns to energy, to the energetics of the moment that are there, will be completely as obvious as it gets. And that can be quite intense. It can fluctuate. It isn't always. It can also come as like a kundalini, like very, very intense energetics coming and going through the body over time. It tends to sort itself out over time. I don't know. I don't have a ton of experience with others who have gone through this, but I know, many now who have talked about it in various ways, and it does sort itself out for sure. But I don't know how long it takes, weeks, months, a couple of years or something. But even then, it just goes to subtler and subtler levels of any discord with this called the energetic flow of reality, non-reality. Any discord that's based on habituation will be dissolved, and that's just how it goes. There's no doership there anymore. There's no will. There's no personal separate self that has a buy-in on anything anymore. But it does rectify itself ongoing. Now, at all of these stages, or working with any of these filters, there is a piece of advice that I think that's reasonably universal, and that is get good at, and this gets a lot easier after an initial awakening, but get good at meditation with what I call unbound consciousness. I have a whole playlist on this, but unbound consciousness is it is a sort of technique. It's a meditative technique, but it's really moving toward thought. It's filtering out, not filtering, but redirecting attention from anything else but the movement of thought and mind and consciousness. And the reason this can be helpful is, especially when we have patterns of discord or patterns of avoidance that are habituated, that have nothing to do with any remaining perceptual filters like we were talking about, and yet they're there. What underlies it is just is will. It's like a human will thing. It's a energetic, and by just reversing that will such that we are moving directly toward everything in consciousness, that can calm that quite a bit. That's one side of it, and then the other side of it is quite the opposite. Is really grounding attention in the sense fields fully, like ongoing, moment to moment to moment, and it's kind of like flying. Like there's no support for this. There's no where to plant the feet, but it seems to just work, and presence works in this way. But the key is knowing, and no one can really teach you this, unless maybe if they've gone through it, they can kind of suggest it as you're going through it, but it's something you just learn, and it's when to do either one of those. There's a natural time to move toward integration and a natural time to move towards disintegration. And the only place you're going to know that is from the energy itself, the energetics of this. And it's an attunement to that. And over time, that's why I think it calms, is because we have much more instinctual insight of when to move in either direction. We're fundamentally rectifying the illusion of the separation of body and mind here, is what I think. So Don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of talking about beliefs at all different levels. And those practices, those last two I mentioned, are valuable at any level. Learning to rest in unbound consciousness by moving toward thought, collapsing the standing wave of mind identification, and the direct experience of the sense fields, particularly the body sense. Those are both very valuable practices, and at different times they can be just what's needed or called for, but because of habituation, we've kind of avoided them. So that's it. Now, I just have to tell everybody, I forgot to say this morning. So anytime I record something, I have to close the meeting so that it will give me the video. So it'll render the video so I can, upload it and stuff. And then I'll just reopen the meeting right after. So I'll close the meeting now and then reopen it after.
Will you give me a chance to ding?
Mm-hmm.